So today, we are in our third week of our 4-week sermon series on Revelation. So a little brief recap before jumping into the text for today. For starters, if you'll remember, there is one important thing that I hope everyone remembers about the book of Revelation, if you remember nothing else. The book of Revelation is singular. It is not plural. There is no S on the end. It is not the book of Revelations. It is the book of Revelation, singular. This is the letter that John wrote to 7 churches describing his revelation, his vision that he had while being exiled on the island of Patmos. Now, as a point of personal privilege, use a little Robert Rules of Order point here, and just a moment so I can boast, I've actually been to the island of Patmos. And let me tell you something, if you're going to have to be exiled somewhere, that is the place to be exiled. It is gorgeous. It is absolutely beautiful. Well, while John was there on the island, he wrote this letter. And this letter is apocalyptic. Now, apocalyptic, normally when we hear that word, we think about all these visions of society that has fallen apart and the remnant of humans that are left over to try to rebuild in the catastrophe. But that's not really what apocalyptic means. That's really more of like the post-apocalyptic genre of literature or fiction. Post-apocalyptic literature or fiction started in the 1800s with Mary Shelley. It got really popular after World War II when we realized that we were capable of creating bombs that could destroy the entire world. One of the classics in this genre, post-apocalyptic literature, is the novel Alas, Babylon. Anyone remember that book or ever read that book by Pat Frank? Come on, don't tell me I'm the biggest nerd here.
What's the title?
Alas, Babylon?
Oh,
there we go. Yeah. Well, Alas, Babylon is basically the concept of there are these 2 brothers, one of them in the military, and they have a phrase, a code, that when the nukes are launched, one says to the other over the phone, Alas, Babylon. And that's the code that the end of times is near. And the reason that's their code is because growing up, they heard a preacher who would often preach and say, Alas, Babylon. And of course, that was based on his sermons from the book of Revelation. So you see, you kind of come full circle. I don't know if that's the connection or the reason for the conflation between apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic, but apocalyptic literature has nothing to do necessarily with the end of the world. Apocalyptic actually means uncovering or unveiling. This is apocalyptic because it is John unveiling or uncovering his vision. Usually these apocalyptic writings have to do with some sort of divine interaction. In this case, it's John who was caught up into heaven. And John is trying to describe this vision, this experience to us. And when he's trying to describe this experience to us, it's just like when one of us tries to explain a dream that we've had. It is increasingly difficult. We might have very vivid images in our mind of a dream that we had, but despite how vivid those images may be, it can be very difficult to explain that dream or that vision to other people. Over the centuries, people have tried to attribute all kinds of different meanings to the pictures and images of John's vision or of John's dream. Many of them predicting the end of the world. Pretty sure they were wrong because it hadn't happened yet. And when we try to talk about describing dreams, it can be so difficult. I mean, 2 of the greatest minds in the modern era were Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. They spent their entire careers taking apart and analyzing and listening to people's dreams, and they couldn't even agree on what dreams meant. So when we come to these words, it's important for us to remember that there is a picture that John is trying to paint for us. A picture of the vision that John had. Now last week when we talked about it, we talked about how also in apocalyptic literature, not only is it unveiling a divine inspiration or a vision, it is also literature that was used to give hope to the hopeless and to challenge others to do better. We see that very clearly in the image of the slaughtered lamb. We read about the slaughtered lamb last week. Penny read about the slaughtered lamb today. The slaughtered lamb who somehow is more powerful than the Lion of Judah. Hope for the hopeless. Power to the powerless. And that's where we are. Last week we were surprised, as I said that I was surprised, to see that when reading Revelation, we didn't get all the doom and gloom I had thought you would get, but more hope and challenge. And so we come to today's text in Revelation. And of course, as soon as I say how wonderful it is that there's no doom and gloom and it's only hope and challenge, we get the four horsemen of the apocalypse. You've got conquering, you've got war, you've got pestilence, you've got famine, you've got death. Real quick, out of curiosity, a couple people asked, and I'm really glad because it made me excited. Does anybody get the connection for the sermon title? Ric Flair and Clint Eastwood with the text today?
Pale Rider.
Pale Rider! Suzanne, right on top of it. Clint Eastwood and Pale Rider. That's right, I've talked about that movie before. I will talk about it again, and I'm going to tell you more about it today, too. But what about Ric Flair? Anybody know? Yes, the Nature Boy, Ric Flair, one of the founding members of the Four Horsemen in wrestling.
Oh.
Really? Am I the only one? That's a shame. Well, see, now, it just kind of happened. They were in an interview, and they started calling themselves the Four Horsemen. It started off with Ric Flair and the Andersons, and that's a different story. But I'm not really sure why they called themselves the Four Horsemen. They probably just thought it was kind of cool and intimidating. I mean, it kind of is. Warfare, death, destruction. Or maybe they called themselves the Four Horsemen because they thought they were going to do cataclysmic change. Who knows? Pale Rider? Pale Rider. Wow. Has anyone else seen that movie besides me and Suzanne? A few of you have. So in the movie Pale Rider, again, I've used it before in sermon illustrations, and you will hear about it again. In the movie Pale Rider, the premise is there are these group of small-time miners, tin pans. And there's a huge mining company that's trying to run them off of their claims. And the mining company has hired all these toughs to threaten them and to accost them and encourage them roughly to leave town. Well, in one of the opening scenes, one of the miners comes to town for supplies and meets the toughs of the mining company. And just as the toughs are starting to rough up the miner, a stranger on a pale horse rides into town. And as the toughs are about to see the end of this miner, the stranger steps in. With an axe handle, sort of evens the score, so to speak. So the miner drives off, and of course he invites the stranger to join him for dinner. And as the stranger rides behind the wagon towards the mining camp, we see a mother and daughter on the screen. And the daughter's name is Megan, and Megan, like any good girl, is reading from her Bible. And she is reading from Revelation. And as the stranger rides in on his horse, she says, "And from the fourth seal I heard a voice that said, 'Come and see.' And the horse that rode out of it was pale, and he that rode on it was death, and hell followed him." Now, the next thing that happens is, as they all are getting ready to sit down for dinner, everyone has heard about this stranger. They know what kind of man he is, what sort of violence of which he is capable. And they make these assumptions about who he is. But when he sits down to dinner, he's taking off his high-collared traveling coat, and we find out that he's wearing the collar of a priest. He's a preacher. There's a secret there, an identity that's being unveiled, that's being uncovered throughout the movie. Revelation, apocalyptic. Something about the imagery here, the horsemen, all that stuff, it is rife in our culture. We see examples of it time and time again. And like I said, over the centuries, people have looked at these riders of the horses, and they have looked at those riders and they have said, "See, look," and they see an event and they point to the horse and they say, "This is a sign of the end of times." But it's not necessarily the case. When you look at the four horsemen, you see that they do represent some very unpleasant realities. That's probably an understatement. Definitely realities, but awful, and tragic, dire realities. War, sword, pestilence, famine, illness, death. When John was talking about this vision and he sees the horse come out, the first horse that he sees is white. And the one riding on the horse is an archer. And the archer on the horse conquers with warfare, with weaponry. Now here's an interesting thing about this. We have to remember at the time when John was writing, this was in the 1st century or so in the midst of the Roman Empire. The majority of the Christians that he was writing to, actually all of the Christians he was writing to of those 7 churches, lived within the safety of the Roman Empire. Now at this particular time, for the past 100 years or so, there was another empire right on the edge of the Roman Empire. I believe it was the Parthian Empire. And the Parthian Empire was known for one thing, that they were able to resist Rome with their military. And what made them special in their military? Mounted archers on pale horses. That was always the deciding factor that kept Rome from invading their empire. That was always the deciding factor that allowed them to push in to the boundaries of the Roman Empire. The boundaries of the empire were not secure when the Parthian archers were at war. So John sees this vision of an image that everyone would know who it was and tells them that that empire that you think is so secure, those borders that you think are so safe, they are not nearly as secure or as safe as you think they are. Next, the horse that comes out is the one that takes away peace from the world. The one that causes human beings to rise up against other human beings and to slaughter one another. Well, we know that if we watch the news, or if we even have just a slight understanding of history, well, this is nothing new. Human beings have been slaughtering human beings, well, since those 2 brothers, Cain and Abel. Nothing new there. Now the next rider is kind of tricky. You see a rider that comes out carrying a scale. This scale is like the kind you see Lady Justice holding a balance. And there's that odd voice that says, a quart of wheat for a day's pay, or 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay. What that means is that wheat and barley are in high demand. And because they are in high demand, they are very expensive. So that leads us to believe that there's a famine going on. They're in high demand because there's not as much of them. A quart of wheat or 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, that was barely enough to live on for the day, and yet it took all the resources of the day to pay for it. This is price gouging in the midst of crisis. Because what's the next line? The olive oil and the wine, they're safe. The luxuries that belong to the rich, they're fine. Because the ones who have money and who have wealth and who have power are the ones taking advantage of those who have less in a time of crisis and in a time of famine. I heard a singer-songwriter one time had a great line. I don't remember the guy's name, but I remember this line from the song. The fat cats keep getting fatter. It happens. We know there's nothing new there. And then, of course, there's death. What's the old cliche? The 2 things in life are certain: death and taxes. Death's going to happen. These are all realities of the world. They're either always happening or always about to happen, looming in the near future. There's nothing new here. These are all pieces of catastrophe and tragedy about which we can do nothing or have very little control. These horses, these riders, these visions of John, they all show how difficult it is to really predict when the end will happen based on these things. Because they always happen. This is the truth and unpleasant reality of life. So here's the challenge. If we listen to Penny doing the reading, you know that we have these unpleasant, dire realities that claim a fourth of the world's population in John's vision. Yet it goes from there, this awfulness, to celebration. How do you get that jump from awfulness to celebration, to the multitude from every nation singing praise to God and salvation to the Lamb? How do you make that jump? That's been really hard for me to figure out. I've really struggled with that. Especially when you consider that these horsemen come out of God's scroll. It makes you ask the question, are these terrible things part of God's plan? Are these awful things God's will? Is God trying to thin the herd, so to speak? I don't know. I sure hope not. But how do you make that jump from these visions of destruction to the multitudes of celebration? This past week, we were really lucky here in Longview to have to be able to take advantage of the poverty conference that was put on by Junior League. Their speaker was a lady by the name of Liz Murray. Hers is a story of how a homeless child whose parents were drug addicts in the Bronx was able to make it one day to Harvard. But anyway, in the midst of her story, she had a line. And one thing that she talked about as being terribly important was gratefulness. And she said, gratitude is realizing that everything that we have, we could just as easily not have. Gratitude is realizing everything that we have, we could just as easily not have. That's how we get the jump from the awfulness to the celebration. The ones who are celebrating have been through the ordeal. They know that there is no true security in nations. They know that death comes to everyone. They know that life is not fair and it is nasty at times. And everything that we have can be gone in an instant. And they celebrate because they are grateful for whatever they have, because God has given it to them. Not because they have earned it, not because they deserve it, but because it came from God. So of course, that's the question for us, right? Are we grateful? Are we truly grateful for every little thing that we have? Or we become entitled? Do we believe that we deserve what we have? We become so accustomed to the luxuries of our life that we cannot even see our own privilege. Or are we grateful, understanding that all of this can be gone in an instant, and we will have no power over it? If we are not grateful, we should heed John's vision of awfulness and celebration. Amen.